In 1984, a young girl and her father from Austin, Texas vanished during a weekend road trip, leaving the mother at home with unimaginable grief and unanswered questions for over a decade. But 16 years later, a junkyard owner finds something shocking. Among the discarded cars, a haunting discovery that would change everything. The autumn sun filtered through the windows of Margaret Holbrook's living room in Austin, Texas, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Margaret sat quietly on her floral-patterned sofa, the television remote clutched tightly in her hand. Her mother Doris perched beside her, her face etched with the same anticipation and dread that had become ritual on this day, each year. "It's almost time," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible as she increased the volume on the television. The local news program flickered on screen, and Margaret leaned forward, her eyes never leaving the set. For 16 years, she had paid local news stations to broadcast a missing persons alert on this day, the anniversary of when her family was torn apart. As the commercial segment began, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The screen displayed a family photograph, a handsome man with a thick mustache and warm eyes, standing proudly, beside a small girl with a bright smile. Beside the photo was an image of a gleaming red Cadillac. 16 years ago today, Jim Halbrook and his 8-year-old daughter Lucia disappeared during a weekend road trip. The announcer's voice stated they were last seen driving a 1979 red Cadillac DeVille license plate, THB 143. If you have any information regarding their whereabouts, please contact the Austin Police Department. Margaret clicked off the television, unable to bear the weight of the silence that followed. She glanced at her mother, noting the grim expression that had settled on her lined face. "I'll go upstairs to freshen up," Doris said, squeezing Margaret's hand before rising slowly from the couch. Margaret nodded, watching as her mother disappeared up the stairs. Left alone with her thoughts, Margaret crossed to the bookshelf that lined the far wall of the living room. Her fingers trailed across the spines of several books before stopping at a worn, leather-bound photo album. She pulled it down and returned to the sofa, opening it with the care one might afford. A sacred text. Page after page revealed moments frozen in time, Jim standing proudly next to that Cadillac he'd worked so hard to forward Lucia on her first day of school. The three of them at Barton Springs, their faces alight with joy. Margaret traced the outline of her daughter's face with a trembling finger. "Where are you?" she whispered. To the photograph, as she had countless times before, the shrill ring of the telephone cut through the silence, startling Margaret. She closed the album and set it aside before crossing to the kitchen to answer. "Hello," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "Mrs. Halbrook, this is Officer Daniels with the Austin Police Department," came the reply. "I'm calling because we've just received a report of potential evidence being found at a junkyard in San Marcos. We believe it could be related to your husband and daughter's case." Margaret's free hand clutched the counter for support. "What kind of evidence? We'd prefer not to discuss details over the phone, ma'am. Would you be available to come identify what's been found? We can have a patrol car pick you up in about 10 minutes. "Yes," Margaret replied immediately, her heart pounding. "Yes, I'll be ready." She hung up the phone and hurried to the bottom of the stairs. "Mum," she called out. "The police just called. They found something at a junkyard in San Marcos. They think it might be connected to Jim and Lucia." Doris appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale. "What did they find?" "They wouldn't say." "But they're sending a car to pick us up in 10 minutes. Doris descended the stairs quickly, her earlier weariness forgotten. "I'm coming with you." They waited in tense silence until the patrol car arrived. The officer at the wheel introduced himself as Officer Martinez, but offered little conversation. During the hour-long drive south to San Marcos, Margaret watched the familiar Texas landscape pass by in a blur, her thoughts racing with possibilities. Beside her, Doris clutched her purse tightly in her lap, her knuckles white when they finally arrived at a Harrove's auto salvage Margaret's stomach twisted at the sight of police vehicles and yellow crime scene tape cordoning off a section of the junkyard. Officer Martinez led them through the maze of junked vehicles toward a cluster of people gathered. Around something Margaret couldn't yet see. Detective Reyes, Officer Martinez called out. As they approached, Mrs. Hellbrook and her mother are here. A tall man in plainclothes turned to greet them, his expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Hellbrook, Mrs. Barrett, I'm Detective Reyes. Thank you for coming so quickly. What did you find? Margaret asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. Detective Reyes stepped aside, revealing what the group had been surrounding. Margaret's legs nearly gave out beneath her. There, crushed almost beyond recognition, but still unmistakable, was a red Cadillac DeVille. The once gleaming paint was now dull and rusted in places. But there was no doubt in Margaret's mind. This was Jim's car, the one he had saved for years to buy, the one he had lovingly maintained, the one he and Lucia had driven away 16 years ago. Oh my God, Doris whispered beside her, gripping Margaret's arm for support. Margaret approached the vehicle slowly, as if in a trance. The car had been partially crushed, presumably by the large excavator parked nearby. Police officers were photographing every angle of the vehicle, while others appeared to be taking measurements and searching the area around it. We can't check the interior because of the condition, Detective Reyes explained gently. But we need to confirm. Is this your husband's car, Mrs. Hellbrook? Margaret circled the vehicle, her eyes scanning every detail. Finally, she stopped at what remained of the right rear wheel. She pointed to a small dent in the chrome wheel cover. Jim hit a curb the week before they disappeared, she said, her voice distant. We were going to get it fixed, but her voice trailed off. She looked up at Detective Reyes, her eyes filled with tears. She refused to shed. Yes, this is their car. Detective Reyes nodded solemnly, then gestured to a man standing nervously at the edge of the crime scene. This is Dean Lam, the owner of the Junkyard. He's the one who called us. Dean stepped forward, wiping his hands on a rag before offering one to Margaret. I'm so sorry, ma'am. I had no idea about the car's history. I swear it was scheduled to be crushed this morning and I was in my office. Afterward, when I saw the missing persons segment on TV, I recognized the car immediately and called the police. How did it get here? Margaret demanded, ignoring his outstretched hand. Who brought it in? Dean shifted uncomfortably. That's just it, ma'am. I don't have any record of it being brought in. It's not in our system at all. That sounds suspicious, Doris said sharply. Detective Reyes held up a hand. Mr. Lamb was the one who alerted us to the car's presence. Mrs. Barrett, we have no reason to believe he was involved in its appearance here. I've been trying to figure out how it got here myself. Dean insisted. We have strict protocols for accepting vehicles, paperwork, IDs, the works. As he spoke, a woman in greasy overalls approached the group I saw. Reed, bring it in, she said. All eyes turned to her. Reed detective. Reyes asked. Reed Caraway, Dean explained. He's my partner. Runs the technical side of things. He's the head technician here. Detective Reyes immediately pulled out his phone. We need to speak with him. Can you call him? Dean nodded and pulled out his own phone, dialing a number. After several moments, he shook his head. No answer. I'll need his home address, Detective Reyes said firmly. Of course, Dean replied, pulling out a small notebook from his pocket and writing down an address. He lives in South Austin. Here's his information. Detective Reyes took the paper and turned to one of his officers. I want a unit sent to this address immediately. Have them bring Mr. Caraway in for questioning. He turned back to Dean. Is there anything else of Mr. Caraway's on the premises that might be relevant to our investigation? His office, Dean said. But it's locked, and only Reed has the key. We'll need a warrant to search it properly, Detective Reyes said, turning to another officer. Get that in motion. Margaret stood silently through this exchange, her eyes never leaving the crushed Cadillac. 16 years of wondering, of hoping, against hope, And now this. The car that had carried her husband and daughter away from her for the last time was here crushed beyond recognition, but no sign of Jim or Lutia. Let's search the area. Detective Reyes instructed his team. Mrs. Halbrook, Mrs. Barrett, if you feel up to it, your help in identifying any potential personal items would be invaluable. Margaret nodded mutely, and she and Doris followed the officers as they began to methodically search the junkyard. Hours passed as they examined piles of scrap metal and discarded items, but nothing related to Jim or Lucia surfaced. Eventually, they found themselves outside Reed Carraway's locked office waiting for either the man himself or the warrant that would allow them to search it. Margaret leaned against the wall, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Doris stood beside her, one arm wrapped around her daughter's shoulders, both women silent and deep in thought as the afternoon sun climbed higher in the sky. The sun reached its peak when 2 police cruisers pulled into the junkyard. Margaret and Doris straightened as they saw a third vehicle, a dark blue pickup truck following behind. The truck parked a short distance away, and a man in his mid-20s climbed out. He had short brown hair and wore work clothes with the junkyard's logo emblazoned on the breast pocket. Detective Reyes approached him immediately, Mr. Carraway. The man nodded, a look of confusion on his face. Yes, that's me. What's going on? The officer said. You needed to speak with me urgently. I'm Detective Reyes, the detective said, extending his hand. We're investigating the appearance of a red Cadillac in your junkyard, one that's connected to a 16-year-old missing persons case. Reed's eyes widened slightly. The car that was crushed this morning, I heard Dean called you guys about it. Detective Reyes nodded toward Margaret and Doris. This is Margaret Halbrook and her mother, Doris Barrett. The Cadillac belonged to Mrs. Halbrook's husband, who disappeared with their daughter 16 years ago. Reed approached the women, his expression appropriately somber. I'm so sorry. To hear that, Reed Carraway, he offered his hand, which Margaret took after a moment's hesitation. The car wasn't properly logged into your system, Detective Reyes continued. One of your co-workers said she saw you bring it in. We'd like to know how it came into your possession. Reed ran a hand through his hair, sighing. Yeah, that was a weird situation. About a week ago, an older man brought it in when Dean wasn't around, said he didn't have any use for the car anymore and wanted it destroyed. Did he give you his name? Detective Reyes asked. Reed shook his head. No, and that's what was strange. He paid cash, a good amount too. But when I tried to get his information for our records, he just ran off. Literally left the keys in the ignition and walked away. I called after him, tried to chase him, but he was gone. Can you describe this man? Detective Reyes pressed. Reed furrowed, his brow in concentration. Tall, maybe 6 feet thin, building gray hair, though it looked like it might have been dark before. He had a mustache, a thick one. Wore glasses, khaki pants, and a button-up shirt. Spoke real quiet, almost hard to hear him. Margaret's breath caught audibly. That sounds like Jim, she whispered to Doris, her face pale. What? Doris said too loudly. But that's impossible. Detective Reyes turned to them. Mrs. Holbrook, are you saying this description matches your husband? Margaret nodded slowly, her hands trembling. It could be the height. The build, the mustache, Jim always wore. Button-ups, even on weekends. Detective Reyes looked back at Reed. How old would you say this man was? Hard to tell. Reed replied, maybe 50s. Could have been younger, though. He looked tired, weathered. Doris shook her head vigorously. This doesn't make sense. Why would Jim get rid of the Cadillac? He loved that car. He worked so hard for it. And why now? Margaret added, her voice stronger. After 16 years. And where is? Lucia. Detective Reyes held up a calming hand. Let's not jump to conclusions. We need to investigate further. He turned back to Reed. We'd like to search your office, Mr. Carraway. One of your co-workers mentioned you keep it locked. Reed nodded. Yeah, of course, nothing to hide. It's just that we keep some valuable tools and parts catalogs in there. Follow me. As they walked toward the small building that housed the Junkyard's offices, Margaret and Doris exchanged troubled glances. Do you really think it could have been Jim? Doris whispered. Margaret shook her head. I don't know. It sounds like him. But why would he abandon the car after all this time? And where has he been? Where's Lucia? I don't believe Jim would do that. Maybe this man is trying to confuse us. Doris suggested, her voice low. When they reached the office building, Reed led them to a door at the end of a short hallway. He pulled out a ring of keys and unlocked it, stepping aside to let Detective Reyes enter. First, please, wait out. Here, Detective Reyes told Margaret and Doris, let you know if we find anything of interest. As the police entered the office, Doris suddenly clutched at her chest, her breathing becoming labored. Mom, Margaret said, alarmed. What's wrong? My asthma, Doris gasped, fumbling in her purse. I think the stress my inhaler. Margaret helped her to a nearby bench. She found the inhaler at the bottom of Doris's purse and helped her mother use it, watching anxiously as Doris's breathing gradually steadied. I'm okay, Doris insisted after a few minutes, though her face remained pale. Just overwhelmed. I'm sorry for the trouble. Would you like us to call an ambulance? Detective Reyes had rushed to her side. Doris shook her head firmly. No, I'll be fine. Just need to rest a bit. While Margaret tended to her mother, the search of Reed's office continued. Occasionally, an officer would emerge with an item to show Margaret and Doris, but each time Margaret shook her head. None of the items belonged to Jim or Lucia. After nearly an hour, Detective Reyes emerged from the office for the final time. We've completed our search, told Margaret and Doris. Unfortunately, we didn't find anything directly connected to your husband or daughter. Margaret's shoulders slumped with disappointment, so we're no closer to understanding what happened. We've made progress, Detective Reyes assured. Her finding the Cadillac is significant. Now we need to figure out who brought it here and why. He turned to Reed. Mr. Carraway, we'd like you to come to the station to make a formal statement. Reed nodded. Of course, whatever I can do to help Mrs. Holbrook. Mrs. Barrett, we'd appreciate it if you'd come. As well, Detective Reyes continued. We'd like to review the case details with you in light of this new evidence. We'll come with you, Margaret said firmly. I'll drive my own car. Reed offered. I'm heading back. Toward Austin anyway. Detective Reyes considered this for a moment, then nodded. That's fine. We'll expect you there within the hour, as they walked back to the police cruiser. Margaret supported her mother, who was still slightly unsteady on her feet. Are you sure you're up for this? Margaret asked quietly. Doris squeezed her daughter's arm. I wouldn't miss it for the world. If there's even a chance of finding out what happened to Jim and Lucia, I need to be there. They climbed into the back seat of the cruiser, watching as Reed got into his pickup truck. As the small convoy pulled out of the junkyard, the sun blazed high in the clear afternoon sky, casting sharp shadows across the crushed red Cadillac. The fluorescent lights of the Austin Police Department cast harsh shadows across the faces of everyone seated in the small conference room. Margaret and Doris sat on one side of the table, Detective Reyes and another officer across from them, while Reed Carraway had given his statement in a separate room. Let's go through the timeline again, Detective Reyes said, opening a thick file folder. Sometimes fresh eyes on old details can reveal something we've missed. Margaret nodded, her hands clasped tightly on the table. Jim and Lucia left on a Saturday morning, October 12, 1984. Jim had his dental practice here in Austin. He was well resected, had built it from nothing. He had this distinctive style about him. The mustache, his colorful ties. His patients loved him. And Lucia. Detective Reyes prompted gently. A small smile touched Margaret's lips. She was 8, so bright, so full of energy. She adored her father, followed him everywhere when she wasn't in school. You didn't go on the trip with them? The second officer asked, making notes. Margaret shook her head. Mom needed help that weekend. She was moving some furniture, rearranging her house after Dad passed. It was supposed to be just on night, a quick trip. Tejano Jim wanted to show Lucia the fall foliage in the hill country, maybe visit Enchanted Rock. They were supposed to be back Sunday evening, and when did you first realize something was wrong? Detective Reyes asked, though he surely knew the answer. From the file before him Sunday night. Margaret replied, her voice growing distant. Jim had promised to call when they left Llano. When I hadn't heard from him by dinner time, I tried the motel. They said Jim and Lucia had checked out that morning. I called. His friends' relatives. No one had heard from them. By Monday morning, I went to the police. Doris reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. We've been looking ever since. Detective Reyes nodded solemnly. The investigation at the time was thorough. Officers checked surveillance footage from gas stations and stores along their route. They interviewed the motel staff diners in the area. Jim's credit cards and bank accounts were never used again. His dental practice remained, untouched. The technology back then wasn't what it is now. The second officer added, no cell phones to track, fewer cameras. We did what we could. And now, 16 years later, his car shows up in a junkyard. Margaret said, her voice tight with emotion. Brought in by Eamon, who matches Jim's description. A heavy silence fell over the room. Detective Reyes closed the file folder and leaned forward, his expression serious. Mrs. Halbrook, I have to ask, is it possible that your husband left voluntarily? Margaret stiffened. Number absolutely not. We had a good marriage. He adored Lucia. His practice was thriving. There was no reason for him to leave. People sometimes have secrets, Detective Reyes said gently. Lives they keep hidden from even those closest to them. Not. Jim. Margaret insisted. And even if that were true, which it isn't, he would never have taken Lucia from me. Never. The door to the conference room opened, and a female officer entered. Reed Carroway's statement has been processed, she informed Detective Reyes. He's waiting in. The lobby. Detective Reyes nodded. Thank you. He turned back to Margaret and Doris. We'll continue investigating this new lead. The car will be thoroughly examined, and we'll try to trace its movements over the past 16 years. In the meantime, I recommend you both go home and get some.